Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. This is How to Hook Readers from page 1. I am so excited. We have an awesome group here. I don't know if this is one of the larger panels, but this is one of the cooler panels. Sorry to all the other panels. I'm going to start by introducing all the panelists that you're going to hear from for this presentation. First up, we have Anna Britton. Anna lives on the Isle of Wight, where she enjoys rambling walks with her chronically clumsy Labrador and exploring rivers in her kayak. Much more outdoorsy than me, that's for sure. She is an experienced freelance editor and loves mentoring other writers. She writes crime thrillers, and her debut, Shot in the Dark, was published in October 2023. When not writing, she's probably reading or hiding from her towering TBR pile, which is why it's good to be in. Next up, I've got Ronni Davis. Ronni lives in Chicago with her husband Adam and her son Aiden. By day, she copy edits everything from TV commercials to billboards, and by night, she writes contemporary teen novels about brown girls falling in love. When not writing, you can catch her playing cozy video games, eating too much candy, or planning her next trip to Disney World. Her debut novel, When the Stars Lead to You, is available from Little Brown Books, and the anthology You Too, in which she's a contributor, is available now as well from Inkyard Press. Her next novel, This Night Is Ours, is out from Little Brown Books for young readers. Next up, Paulette Kennedy.
Not working right.
Oh, there, I love it. Look at that. Yes. And definitely everyone who is watching, at the end, my favorite thing is to do a where do I find you or what do you want to tell us? So at the end, we want to make sure that everyone knows where to find you, both because, hey, maybe you'd be a good source of information, and also we want to read your books, right? So at the end, I'm going to mention that. I want everyone to tell me where I can find you. Next up, I have Paulette Kennedy. Paulette, and it is. We got on this when it was not even 7 a.m. her time, so look how dedicated she is to doing this. Oh my gosh. Paulette Kennedy is the best-selling author of The Witch of Tin Mountain, The Devil and Mrs. Davenport, and Parting the Veil, which received the prestigious H&S Review Editor's Choice Award. She has a lifelong obsession with the Gothic, and as a young girl, she spent her summers among gravestones in her neighboring cemetery, imagining all sorts of romantic stories for the people buried there. I love that. I feel like Paulette and Matthew, who I'm going to introduce from Salem, really need to get together, making connections here. After her mother introduced her to the Brontes as a teenager, Paulette's affinity for fog-covered landscapes and haunted heroines only grew, inspiring her to become a writer. Originally from the Missouri Ozarks, she now lives with her family and a menagerie of rescue pets in the sunny Southern California, where sometimes, on the very best days, the mountains are wreathed in fog. We have Matthew next. And again, making connections here. Matthew Phillion is a Salem-based author of the Indestructibles YA superhero series and several spin-offs, including Echo in the Sea, The Dungeon Crawlers. A former journalist and filmmaker, he has written about everything from healthcare and biotech to cybersecurity. He was also the creative director for the first 2 seasons of Dungeons & Dragons actual play podcast, The Raven Folly Institute Presents, a gothic horror improvisational storytelling show. Which, Salem, again, we're getting there. I love this. Next up, I have J.R.H. Lawless. Jay is a Hugo best-selling and astounding long list nominated author from Atlantic Canada who blends comedy with political themes, drawing heavily in both cases on their experience as a lawyer. I'm a lawyer too. We can talk about how terrible that was. No. Drawing heavily on as a lawyer, and this is very cool, and as Secretary General of the Parliamentary Group at the French National Assembly.
One of them at least, please.
Yeah. It got you, like you said, it got you the experience, right? Their novels, Always Greener, The Rude Eye of the Rebellion, and This Is the Good Part, are part of the General Buzz series. They are represented by Rick Lewis at Martin Literary. All right, with that introduction, we have our awesome panelists. We have their fantastic pedigree to tell us that, yes, these are people you should be listening to about how to hook readers. And so I'm going to start digging, well, I'd say the most important question, but okay, what do we need to have a good hook? As a writer myself, tell the rest of us listening, what do I need for a good hook? And anyone who would love to start, or I will call on you. So. Matthew, you look like it. Yeah, you look ready to talk, so please.
I never want to go first, but I'm always willing to be the first one to
I
jump
love
into the
it. No,
pool.
please do. Please do.
I just I always the rule that I like to go by is telling the story that you want to tell. So for a good hook, like what, think about the sort of story, the moment that you go, oh, I need to finish this story. Like I want it like, I always think of whether it's a book or a TV show where you get to that one moment and like a puppy, your ears go up. And think about the sort of moments in other stories that do that and like what evoked that emotion and then find your moment, like what is your call to action? I mean, that's a, everybody loves that. What's the call to action is uh, everybody use that term, but I just think of my favorite piece of advice that I ever got was you're not the only one who's going to find what you write entertaining. So if you can write something that entertains yourself, you'll find an audience that is also entertained. So just what would entertain you to have happen? And so that's my call to action is like what would make my ears perk up like my dogs and want me to keep going? And that's where I start. What is that for? What is that thing that I know will propel the story and give the character something to chew on?
I think that's really true. About half an hour ago, I just started Night Shift by Annie Crown. And the first line is, I really love nighttime at the library or something. So immediately my little puppy ears were like, okay. And I know that's like lots of people that maybe wouldn't interest them, but obviously like Annie and me both love libraries, love reading. And so actually that story had me hooked straight away. There was very little she could do wrong from that point on. So yeah, knowing that you're not going to please everyone, but that what you write is going to please some people, and it's probably hopefully going to please you as well, I think is a really good way to start off.
Are there any other thoughts? What are the elements that sort of make up a good hook?
Yeah, I'm not sure if hooks are necessarily what you want. I don't know if a hook is like a Lego build that you need to have certain specific elements to. I think a hook is more, it's more about, it has to be impactful, it has to be punchy, it has to, get that interest. I think the imagery of the hook is interesting because I come from like a fishing community. We talk about a hook, you think about something, you need to like hook the fish, who's your reader. And I don't know if that's the right image necessarily. I like to think of the hook, and when I do mentorship with Sifwa or WriteHive as a great mentorship program, plug. When I talk about hooks, it's more, I like the hook like your left hook or your right hook. It has to be like an actual punch to your reader, not necessarily, obviously not literally, or and not even necessarily it has to be like if it can be actiony, like starting in media res grade, but it doesn't have to be that, depending on the genre, depending on what you're writing. But it has to have that initial punch, to be short and sweet, ideally, to have that punch, to get that impact, get the interest hooked. Yes, if that's your fish, then fine. But I plus that imagery that's like you can have like if you're right-handed, like your right hook that you expect maybe with your genre, you're making your core promise about your genre, but maybe it's like, okay, it's an action thing. We're starting with some action, whatever. But then maybe you can have like a left hook that comes out of nowhere and it's like something you're not expecting. It's a surprise, and you're hooking them by starting with something that they're not at all expecting. So playing with the imagery, sometimes you can actually get to some useful concepts to use there.
I think that's really helpful too, particularly when you talk. It's not a Lego build. It's not a foundational thing. I love that it's actually a hook, and this is the surprise for them. Ronni, Paulette, any other comments on this? And maybe that just means I didn't ask the right question when I say what the core elements are. So I mean that because that's what it sounds like. Maybe there's not core elements. It's the surprise. It's the thing that gets someone interested. But what are other of your thoughts, if you have any, on this particular part of the question? What makes a good one? Or what's needed to make a good one?
I think yeah, not necessarily again like thinking of four elements, and it may just be that I don't have a language for what those four elements are. But for me, it's something where I read the first few lines and I'm like, what on earth got them here? And then wanting to know, like, why do they feel this way? Why are they thinking this way? What do they want that's making them act or say or do this thing? A lot of times I like to read a thriller that has Like they usually kind of start at like a part where you're like, okay, she's like bleeding out in a bathroom, and then they kind of rewind, and I'm always like, how on earth did she end up in this situation? So I think it's something like that. It's going to be something like, why are they thinking like this? Why do they feel this way? What kind of upbringing or history do they have that brought them to this point in the story where they have to, it just has to burst out of them. So I think that, and they have to know, and so does the reader.
For me, the biggest thing that I have found that has been helpful is getting to know my voice as an author. And that comes with time and that comes with practice. And one of the elements that I've found works really well for me and something that attracts me to other people's fiction is a short declarative statement when the book opens that intrigues and pulls you in and makes you wonder and makes you ask the right kind of questions that inspires you to keep reading. So I try to do that in my work. I think knowing your character really, really well helps with that too. Knowing what their internal process is with how they're viewing the world and what's happening to them. I think action, getting right into the action is good, but you also want to ground the reader a bit too, because if you go right into the action and things just take off at a sprint, that can be a little bit off-putting because they need to find their feet a little bit, at least through your character's eyes. So it's kind of like that full immersion that happens with voice. And I think that just comes with time and practice and reading other people's work.
Awesome. Well, so it sounds like part of this is it's a good hook is also knowing where to start the story. So it sounds like, we hear that adage about how you don't want to start the story with, well, maybe again, there's always exceptions, but I woke up and started brushing my teeth going forward. So with that thought in mind of how you all have described a hook, kind of knowing when to start the story, how do you know when you've written a good hook? That this is actually the hook versus this is my brushing my teeth moment.
I'll say I'm not afraid to acknowledge when I'm bored writing something. There's that whole idea like don't write the part you don't want to write it, because if you don't want to write it, the reader's not going to want to read it probably. And it's okay, like you said, brushing your teeth or like waking up in the morning, like you don't have to. It's okay to not write the part that isn't interesting to you. Start at the part that would get you engaged. Start your story after your first cup of coffee, proverbially. Because there is that kind of like, oh, I've got to write this part or I've got to do that. It's okay to start with what gets your pulse rate up emotionally, or whether you're right. I mean, I write a lot of action stories, so I tend to think of that way, but I loved the right hook, left hook thing because I'm like, oh, I was expecting an action sequence and I got an emotional hook. Oh, like, and you get the shot from the other direction. But I think as a writer, I know I've written a good hook if I don't want to stop, if it doesn't feel like work. Because occasionally we write ourselves into corners and it does start to feel like work. So it's that's when I know I've got something good, is if I don't want to put it down, then I know I'm heading in the right direction. And it's okay to listen to your heart or your head or whatever you write with, to go, oh, this is okay. If this isn't engaging to me, maybe I'm pulling on the wrong thread here. And change the camera angle and try to see if there's a different viewpoint or a different starting point to get yourself going. Because you really are your own first reader, so try to hook yourself first is what I usually where I usually turn. If I'm not hooking myself, I'm not going to hook a reader. So
I really like that. I like that. Change the camera angle. Does anyone else have any other thoughts? How do we know when we've written a good hook? Does part of it involve that? I mean, if I change my camera angle and I do start it at coffee versus brushing my teeth, is that a way to tell that, or rewriting, or how does that help me know that I've written a good hook? Is that part of it? Jay, you're nodding, so I'm gonna.
I am. I didn't necessarily want to jump in and front load with all the he pronouns, but basically, there's a good hook, obviously, which is exactly what Matthew just said. There's potentially, I think, what is the best kind of hook. And so, you know, you could, when you know that, yeah, you've got something that's really great, is when it potentially is a whole story on its own, and reading the hook, I mean, particularly like the first line, those most crucial words in your book, when reading that already sets off the reader's imagination, and they're already projecting what this could mean, what, you know, they're already inventing a whole story based off that line. I mean, there's when I was studying Spanish, Latin America anyway, I was reading about so these great super short stories. In this case, extremely short story by this guy called Augusto Monterroso, and there was one called El Dinosaurio. It's famous as like the shortest story ever. It's just like one line, and when he woke up, the dinosaur was still there. And so basically having something super short that lets you project into potentially a whole story before and afterwards is, in my mind, the best kind of hook you need to aim for. I don't always do it myself, I don't always succeed, but you know, when you get there, when you read them, you're like, yeah, that's a hook right there.
Paulette, you were nodding earlier too when Jay was, so do you have any thoughts, or how do we know anything to add to when we know we have written a good hook? This is the good hook. Is there any tips on that?
Well, I loved your analogy of a lens and focusing and changing the camera angle, because I am a photographer. And I kind of approach my opening sequence or my opening scenes as a photographer would. So I'm zooming in and I'm zooming out. I'm like going in and like getting into my character's head and what matters to them. But I'm also like giving the reader a wide angle view of the setting and what's happening in the setting, so that they feel grounded. And I love that it takes a little bit of time sometimes to find your feet. Oftentimes I'll finish the entire book and then I'll go back and I'll rewrite the beginning, because at that point I know my character really well. I know their motivations. I know where the story is going. I outline, but even still, like, I do a lot of discovery writing as I'm working. And I think the opening, sometimes you don't really know how to start until you end. And that's kind of the only thing I really have to add.
I like that. Thank you. What about, how do we test a hook? Or if anyone has any other thoughts, I don't want to cut anyone off, but this kind of feeds into the question, and maybe we've already answered it, but that is one of the questions here, that how do we test a hook?
I think what I was going to say about how do you know you've got a good hook actually answers the next question. Because I for my second book, which is coming out in September, it's called Close to the Edge, I had a starting scene that I thought was amazing. And it was someone waking up in a way. But they were in a hospital, and they were kind of like in a situation where they're kind of waking up and they're remembering things, and then they realize that the person sitting next to them is someone they really don't want to sit next to them, but they've forgotten to change their next of kin. So I was like, oh, this is like really cool and really creepy. And then my editor read it and was like, no, nothing's happening. This is really boring. And I was like, oh, okay, there's lots of nuance in it that I really loved, but whatever. So then I wrote a different scene, like I love the changing camera angle, lensy thing. I'm not a photographer, so I'm sorry if I've said the wrong thing. But like the idea, so I had sort of two storylines, and then I was like, right, okay, I'll switch to the other one and kind of start there. So instead it starts with someone trying to get out of like a blindfold and a gag, and they're all tied up and stuff, and then they're trying to escape from somewhere, and my editor was like, yes, this is exciting, this is grabby. So what I would say is that, like, for me, part of my process is like, I love just writing and seeing where it goes, but actually then kind of trusting other people to tell me you've got something there and you've grabbed me, and also being like, I don't know, like maybe not humble, but like being like gracious enough to say like, oh yeah, maybe I got it wrong, and I'll go with your idea. So yeah.
I love that, and I love, well, I know I'm really intrigued too to read the story that could have started in the hospital upset, but now you're getting out of a blindfold. I mean, you've hooked me.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Ronni, do you have any thoughts on either this question or the other question as far as how do you test a hook?
I think it just, if I want to keep writing, if I write a first line and I'm not feeling it, then probably readers aren't going to feel it either. So I'll just kind of keep trying it and I'm like, oh wait, this is good. Now I want to keep going because I need to figure out, like I said earlier, like how she got here. So I think that's the way that I kind of pressure test it, at least when I'm starting out. And then I just let the powers that be help me along when it comes to other readers and things like that.
Awesome. I think from what you've all told me here just now, I can probably infer some answers to this question, but this is a question on my list, so I'm going to ask. What are the pitfalls to avoid when crafting hooks? Like I said, I think I can infer it, maybe you've implied it in some of these things, don't be boring, stuff like that. But what are the pitfalls? If someone who's just looking at this, what are the pitfalls in crafting hooks to avoid?
I think someone said it earlier, that I think it was Paulette, that you have to ground the reader first, like going, like I keep thinking of the one like new Star Wars by Disney, and how I think it was Rogue One, where it just kind of threw you into the action. It was just boom, 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 and I was like, I don't know anything about these people. I don't care anything about these people. So why are you showing me all this stuff happening to these people? So I think the hook needs to have some kind of grounding in it so that you actually care about why the character is where they are when this story opens. Otherwise, it's just kind of like the 1-2 punch, but not the good kind, not the kind that Jay was talking about. It's the bad kind that it hurts and you're kind of left stunned and a little like unmoored because you're like, I don't understand what I'm doing. I don't understand what this is about. So I think that grounding, even just a little bit of grounding, just a little bit, just to show us like where they are, what they're thinking, and how they're feeling. It, at least for me, it's helpful.
Yeah, that's super interesting because the common wisdom it would be you don't want to start with loads of world building, you need to possibly start with loads of action, or at least, not info dump. And yet that grounding, when I was talking like maybe the unexpected sort of left hook, that's actually what I had in mind. Some of my more recent work and this fantasy project I'm working on currently, I found myself thinking actually having like an unexpected world building based left hook starting that first sentence actually works really well. So it's not necessarily, doesn't have to be, even in a thriller, even in sci-fi fantasy, even in something that is, depending on what you're doing, more active and more action based often. World building isn't a bad word either, but obviously it's about balance. It's about having that grounding, done properly, and that's a whole nother subject. But yeah, I think one of the pitfalls could be being too much in that action mentality, being too much in that, oh, we can't world build, we can't info dump, ooh, it's so terrible. You can't supposedly, wake up in a hospital room, but maybe you can. Depending, how it's done, depending, it's so many people start books with, waking up in a bed, or, looking in a mirror, or, all these classic tropes. It's also because there is something there. And how you do it is I think where it's all about.
I've never just put it this way before, but I want to float a theory by the panel here. Who, what, when, where, and why pick 3? Like, you don't have to establish them all, but if you have, you got to give some context so the reader knows where they are and what they're getting into, and you don't have to do all 5 at the same time, because that's info dumping. But if you can tell them who, where, and when, or what, where, and why, just give us some context. I'm making this up on the fly. Maybe it's garbage, but that idea of like, you don't give them everything, but you got to give them something so that that's that that hook, whether it's a punch or a fish hook, that can pull you in the right direction. Give them enough to care, but not so much that they don't want to know what's around the next corner or the next page.
I really like that. I really like the building that we have from Paulette, Ronni, and Matthew, you adding on, particularly Ronni. I think that's so important. I need to be hooked, but I also need to care. Like, why do I care that this person is being blindfolded somewhere? That hook's gotta want me to know and want me to get. I have to want them to get out, right? And so I like that. I really like the pick 3. That's interesting. Paulette, any thoughts as well? I mean, I think this is where we're wrapping around to kind of what you had started, which is about grounding. And it's, were there any other pitfalls maybe that I think again we can infer a lot more. Don't do too much world building. Again, we're trying to interest them, and that's hard, particularly in fantasy. What are your thoughts, Paulette?
Well, yeah, the going along with the info dumping and too much world building, because you can do that too. Like, you can put too much description, make things so dense that the reader just gets bored. Because they need to care, ultimately they need to care. One of the writers who I think does the combination of world building and making you care and making you ask the right kind of questions is Silvia Moreno Garcia. She does a really, really good job, like, especially the opening lines of The Beautiful Ones. Like, he's describing what he's seeing in this ballroom and what's happening, but you get his attitude and his opinions about this because he's describing a colonial setting. And so you get a little bit of both. So you get his voice and you also get what he's seeing so that you're grounded in the world. One of the things that will kind of throw me off as a reader with an opening is if there are too many names. All of a sudden, like at the beginning of the story, too many characters introduced all at once, because I feel like my attention is kind of scattered and I want to have a little bit, going back to that camera analogy, a little bit of laser focus on whose point of view I'm in before a bunch of other characters start coming into the mix. So I think introducing those important secondary characters is important, but you kind of want to thread things in a little at a time, especially for your readers. I'm ADHD, and so if I have too many characters coming at me all at once, it makes me lose interest.
Anna, anything to add? Maybe what other pitfalls to avoid, or kind of a hearing on what everyone else is saying?
Yeah, I feel like what everyone else has said is great. I think my only last thing to add would be thinking about because you've got your genre, but also thinking about your tone. So I think sometimes I'll read a book and the start will make promises that the rest of the book doesn't quite deliver. So I think for me, just making sure there's that consistency of saying what Matthew said about so my book's a thriller, so I kind of don't tell you why the person's doing it or who they are, because that's going to be part of the mystery that's being solved. Whereas actually, if you reveal too much I think just thinking about what you reveal at the start and what tone you're setting. Do you want it to be cozy? Do you want it to be comfortable? Do you want it to be unsettling? Do you want it to be kind of really fast paced? And then the scene that's coming after that, thinking about that and sort of how do they slot together and kind of does that work? Because I think actually hooking a reader is great, but I'm not a fisherman, so sorry if I get this wrong, but maybe your fish gets off the hook because the bait you've given them is bad or something. But actually it's all well and good hooking someone with this amazing first scene, but then if the rest of the book doesn't sort of consistently deliver on what that scene promised, then think about your tone, I guess.
I really like that. I really, particularly as you say, so if someone starts the book tied up, but it turns out it's like a sweet contemporary romance.
Yeah.
You've hooked them, but maybe not in the right. That'd be a pitfall, I think, following that tone. I really like that, Anna. And I was going to say, so you reeled up a boot or something instead, right? We're doing this. We're
fishing. Yeah.
It
works.
Sorry, Jay. The non-fishers here.
I'm just picturing a writer on a dock holding a broken fishing pole, going, oh
no,
weeping, I'm sure. So again, I think we may have answered this, but sometimes, you know, I do, as for the audience at home, we get a list of questions, and so we don't want to scare our panelists and surprising them too much. But so I think we have answered these, but sometimes when I ask it just outright, there's ping, so we get a lot more information. So we may have already talked about this a little bit when we talked about grounding, and we talked about the three, picking three of the 5 W's. But how do you find the line between doing too much and doing just enough to hook the reader? And so I think Jay's talked about that a little bit. Matthew did, Ronni did. We've all done it, but this is my direct question: is how do we find that line?
I think it if you're feeling overwhelmed in that first thing, I think we need to know too is like the hook doesn't need to just be the first line. It can be like the first paragraph. So you can breathe a little bit. So I know some of my issues in the past was trying to put too much of the story though in that first paragraph to give kind of like a high level summary or whatever. And you don't have to do that. It's okay to make the reader have to wait to learn things. Like Paulette was saying, like when people throw in too many characters at the beginning. So I think finding the balance where you're not feeling overwhelmed, but you're feeling like satisfied yet curious. It's like you've had your dinner, but now you're ready for dessert and there's room for it. So I think that's where you want to go with it. And I think that just takes experimenting, practice, feedback from whomever you share your work with.
And I think that's a good, not plug for the name, which I did not come up with, of course, but I really like that, Ronni. It's not how to hook readers from the first line per se. Maybe you can. Jay gave us a great example of a one sentence story, but it's hooking them from page 1. So for you, it's finding the line of doing too much and doing just enough is giving yourself that breathing room, right? Not packing all the punch in the first line. Maybe you give yourself a paragraph or two. Right? Any other thoughts?
I think the line, by definition, is what's between your fishing pole and the hook, right?
Look, oh my gosh, look at that.
This isn't a room full of writers creating metaphors on the fly, right?
But actually, semi-seriously, answer the question. I think, that moment where, you've done draft 1, 2, 3, whatever, X, and, you leave it, you come back and you start to reread it, particularly reading it out loud is always amazing. But that's a crucial moment for that start as well. It is for the rest of the book, but especially that start. And that's something that I have learned as well through experience and for not having done it necessarily well enough all the time, or at least not necessarily taking everything into consideration. I mean, this guy here, this is the good part, which is the 3rd book in my currently published series, starts with a very weird hook, which might potentially put some people off, and I didn't necessarily measure it. I was going for like I was going for humor, but it's also a little bit gross, so I don't know. So there's that. And that's, again, the editorial process, the whole team you work with, but your own editorial process as well. It's coming back to the whole killing your darlings thing. That humility that I think it was Anna was talking about is really, really important, to, know when to accept, or was it Ronni maybe? Sorry, but to accept when, yes, that, actually, that this thing doesn't really work at all, and did it even really work for me? I don't know. Right? So there's that's probably where you find that line, through rereading, through trying to step away, reset, come back to it, and trusting in all the team that you work with, even if they're not necessarily there to say, oh, you should do this instead of this, but they're definitely there if they're pointing out something that they feel is an issue. You really should listen to that. Make the solution your own, but definitely listen to people who are coming, who are there. It's their job. and you're damn lucky to have them in the first place, to come towards you to you know, to point out stuff.
I like looking at how other genres handle the hooks too. I worked in film before I worked in novels, and the idea of the cold open, you know, what'll get you before the credits roll at the beginning of a show or a movie. You can learn a lot of lessons. It's a very different writing format for novel writing, but you can take a lot of lessons for how to get something in a very compact amount of space that will pull a reader in before they put the book back on the shelf and pick up something else with a cooler cover, you know, down the road. Or even because I was the creative director for a storytelling podcast, and watching if the other actors lean in to hear more of the story. I'm like, okay, there's my okay, that's the part I'm going to pull on. That's the thread I'm going to pull on. I actually think authors can benefit a lot from messing around with, maybe not professionally, but even on a playful basis in other mediums, to see how you connect with an audience, and what you can bring to your writing that way. Because that's one of those things that I always want to see. I always want to see that people only listen to the audio, they're not seeing me lean towards the camera awkwardly, but that whole idea of like what makes them lean in a different medium can help with book reading too. Because then you are going to see someone in the bookstore going, huh, you know, and leaning in like, oh, I'm going to bring this one home with me. I like what you can take from the more time you can spend looking at other mediums can really benefit. I also think filmmakers can learn a lot from us, you know. So that's something. If you're feeling a little stuck, look at how other mediums work and see how they hook people.
Any other thoughts? I have a follow-up that I don't want to surprise anyone with, but I do have a follow-up from both Jay and Matthew have said, but I want to hear if anyone else on this, how do we find the line, as it were? Anyone else have thoughts?
I'll say. Oh, sorry.
No,
Paulette, then Anna? That's it.
Well, the only thing that I'll say is like a cue for me that I need to maybe slow down or take a break or come back to my opening later is when I become to the point where I'm relying too much on stage directions or backstory, and I get bored. You know, it's like a lot of it's trusting your instincts and also trusting your team, you know, your critique partner, your editor, like if you're independent, like having beta readers and things like that to tell you. Usually your first draft is you just getting the words down and kind of telling the story. And then the second and third is where, for me at least, like the prose really starts to become more refined. So that's all I have to add.
Oh, that's awesome. Anna, your thoughts?
It's similar actually. In one of my last edits that I do on my books is like a really line by line kind of, I call it like interrogating the writing. And I think particularly with the first scene, when you're kind of sort of vaguely happy with it and you're like, yes, this starts in the right place, and kind of I feel like I want to start with this person and I want them to know this, and blah, blah, blah. And you kind of got all those big things, but then going down to a sentence level and being like, right, what do they really need to know? And like Paulette said, like not too much stage direction. Have I got enough feeling in here? Have I got enough thoughts in here? Have I got enough like sort of what's going on around them in here? And kind of, yeah, just really going down. And like I find that sometimes my opening scenes will maybe start like 1,000 words and then they'll reduce down to 500 because I've interrogated it so much and been like, no, I don't need that. I don't need that bit. I've already said that she's crying. I don't need to say it again. Like, and kind of like, yeah, just being really like kind of mean with your writing, really. Yeah.
Like that being mean. So my follow-up question kind of it cycled off a little bit of what you just said, Jay. And that was you mentioned that the book behind you is the third in the series. Is that right? Yeah. So my question, and also for Matthew, because I know Matthew's at least done the storytelling part when we're in the same world, is the line different when we're in a sequel or the third book, the fourth book, when we're doing a serial type? You know, particularly when we talk about the need for grounding and all that, is that line of doing too much or too little when hopefully the readers, when they're picking up book 3, already know your world? Is that line different, would be my question. How does the hook change for books 2, 3, or for a serial?
That's a great question. I'd say yes and no. I think that what you have established in theory with the series, and something you can count on, is what somebody else was saying earlier, which was really good, about the promises you're making through your hook. I think that is established. I think somebody knows when they're buying, even if they're jumping into a series for whatever reason, at book 2, book 3. The promises are there. At the same time, every novel in a series needs to stand on its own legs, and you can't necessarily rely too much, or you shouldn't rely too much, in my mind, on necessarily everybody knowing, having read the previous books, or knowing, so I think it's important to reestablish your characters. And plus, characters change. I mean, this book here, again, pointing behind, it's really handy, is 25 years after the second book in the world. So there's a big jump. There's a whole generational jump. And characters have changed. Main characters changed. Point of view is different. There's a whole bunch of different stuff, right? So I think it's important to, I mean, you see books sometimes, and without, pointing and shaming, but where literally you have descriptions of characters, 10 books into a series, where he will literally copy paste, it's a he, literally copy paste a page worth of description put in directly. Now, I know I've read this before. I can quote line for line what I'm about to read. I've read this many times before. I've read previous books in your series. Thank you very much. I mean, great for churning out books real quick, but I'm not, it's not really how you want to be doing it. So I think, yes, it does impact it for sure. I think you have to, keep up with the promises that you've already made. You can sort of rely on that much, I think, but also it has to be, it's updated, it's fresh, things are changing. If things aren't changing, then maybe they need to, or maybe you should move on to something else, creatively wise, because a series has to end at some point. But it's always a factor to take into account, I think, for the whole book, but definitely for that first, the first line, first paragraph, when you're making your promises for that book. The rest is there, but it doesn't mean you can get lazy with it.
I just saw saw a whole conversation among readers going, I wish they'd put a summary at the beginning of the book, because I can't remember what I had for breakfast. How do I remember what happened in this series last year, or whenever the last book came out? And I've always wondered, like, how much is too much? You don't want to overdo it when you're establishing. I'm in a weird position because I never knew if I was going to get a contract for the next book, so I wrote each one in the series like it was the only one, or was going to be the last one. I wrote everyone like it was going to be the last one. So I did a lot of trying to not overfeed. I love the idea when you mentioned, like, you had room for dessert after Ronni, when you said that earlier. Like, I kept picturing, like, oh no, I went too hard on the bacon at brunch. I'm in trouble now. But it's that I think every book in a series has to have its own hook and its own strengths. I feel like if you're writing a series, every book should be able to stand on its own enough that somebody might go, wait a minute, oh no, I missed book 1, and then go back and like go find like, because you hear about that a lot of times with the fantasy book, like, how'd you start on book 3? I'm like, I don't know, I was reading 100 pages and it was really good, and then I realized I was missing some context. I think that's my dream goal for any series, is like to be able to accidentally pick up the 3rd book, have enough context to be engaged by it, and then get kind of annoyed at yourself that you didn't know there was another one. You missed the number on the spine, and you're like, that's my favorite example of that. There's a Joe Abercrombie writes sort of grim fantasy, and I picked up one of his standalone books that references back to his original trilogy. Standalone book reads amazing. It made me buy every book he ever wrote. But as I'm reading it, I'm like, wait a minute, I think this guy's got a history I should know about, and I'm not aware of it. And I think that's kind of a good goal for a series, is like, it hooked me enough that I read it was amazing on its own, but made me go, oh, wait a minute, well, there's more to this. So that's the, I think that idea of every book needs its own unique hook, and acknowledging where it came from. I had a reader message me the other day, oh, I'm rereading the books, and I realized how much you set up in book 1. I'm like, I didn't set up in book 1. I just kept pulling from my own history and like, oh, this, like, so it's that discovery as a writer too. Like, uh, people, if people can think you planned it, you're doing better than you think you are. Like, I don't know, does that ever happen to anybody else? Like, I didn't mean for that to happen, but hey, look how good I am at this. Like, I've created a thing that people think I did on purpose.
Unintentional foreshadowing, and everyone thinks it's intentional.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, awesome. So yes.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about like having to make it fresh. So there's this author named Susan Beth Pfeffer, an older author, and she did this series of books called the Sebastian Sisters, and it was each sister as they turned 16. In every book, at the start, the first line was always "What a dump," and the same character said it in every book. And I just loved that consistency. I loved that that like, okay, I know what I'm getting into. These people were rich and now they're poor again. And then the main character, and this one character is saying, God, we're back in the dump. I think Sophie Kinsella did it as well with the Shopaholic books, where every one starts with, okay, don't panic, don't panic. So you're not like, you already know, like, oh God, she's up to her shenanigans again. So I think it could work when you have that predictability in there, but maybe that only works better with contemporary as opposed to like a fantasy or a science fiction. So maybe the genre plays into that, having to play with a hook.
Awesome. And I love, well, I'm gonna go look that up. And I also love Sophie Kinsella, so I really like that thing. I haven't heard that name in a while. So the last question before I want to know where we can find you, where we can read all of your awesome books. What's worked for you and what hasn't? And if you have resources, I know we've said some author names, which I think is great as maybe to look at, but what's worked for you and what hasn't as you have been on your author journey and creating good hooks. Paulette, I might.
Well, kind of like what Ronni was saying, I don't open with the same line, but I kind of have a little bit of a brand, I think. And like what has worked for me is short declarative sentences that make a strong statement. And all of my books kind of have that as kind of a through line. Like instead of having one long opening line, probably The Devil and Mrs. Davenport has my longest opening line, but all my other books have more short sentences kind of strung together. And I noticed recently, whenever I was reading Whale Fall by Daniel Kraus, he kind of does the same sort of thing. And I think that like just finding your voice as an author, like, is a huge part of that. Like knowing what works for you. And for some people, it is like a really long sentence. Like there are examples of authors who do that like they'll have a whole page that is one sentence, and that is kind of something that defines their style. So it's really just getting to know yourself a little bit. And I've been writing since I was 19, and I think I've just now found my voice, like at 49 years old. So sometimes it can take a while, and just giving yourself patience and like trusting your instincts and all that. And that's just something that I've learned to like have a little bit of grace with myself about, and also just listening to the input of people who you admire and people who know your work and know your voice too. It's really helpful.
Awesome. Matthew, what about you? What's worked for you and what hasn't? I am kind of just going in a circle on my screen now, so everyone's aware. So you're up next, Matt.
All right. And going back to that changing the camera angle thing, I've always found if it's not working for me, is this the wrong character to start with? Is this the wrong location to start with? And just that's how I get myself out of a rut. Is if it doesn't feel that, if it's not the right place at the right time, it might be the right story. I just gotta like, oh, this isn't the eyes we need to see this scene through. And also for the hook, I always know where I want to end. I start with the ending. I don't let myself write the ending till I get there. That's my dessert. Like you don't get to write the finale till you get to the finale. But finding my hook is easier when I know where I want to get to in the end. So I always know my ending, and that's what I write towards. And so suppose it makes me a plotter instead of a pantser. I don't know, but I don't. But really, if you're looking for a hook, you got to know what you're fishing for.
I like that, and that
we're
is
just gonna keep going.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, and I don't know if there's a plotter pantser debate this year. There is one from last year. I moderated that, and yeah, knowing where the ending is, that might be troubling for some of the pantsers, but that's awesome, Matthew. All right, Anna, you're next on my little circle here. What's worked for you? What hasn't?
I think it's similar to Paulette in just like figuring out yourself and your style. So Shot in the Dark is the book that sort of netted me an agent and a publisher, but before that I wrote maybe 10 books, maybe more, and definitely wrote lots of starts that then didn't go on to be a book. And I think it's just it's trial and error, isn't it, and figuring out I think particularly when you're querying agents, you spend a lot of time thinking about your start and how that's going to work. Sorry, I've just completely noticed Matthew's dog on his lap.
Sorry, my terrier just jumped up on camera. I apologize for the interruption, but he has decided that he wanted to be part of the conversation, and I'm sorry for interrupting you.
No, that's fine. I was like, oh my gosh, there's a dog.
I didn't expect him to jump either.
You've hooked us onto watching you. Look at that. There's the surprise. Oh.
When in doubt,
We
throw the
leaned
puppy,
in
right?
to look at the dog.
Yeah.
Include a dog. That
Always.
will.
Let's make amazing hooks.
It does work.
But I think I was just saying, just getting to know your voice and how you work, and kind of that's my.
Anna. All right, Jay, you're next in my.
Right. So we'll beyond insert, whatever pet / fantasy or science fictional creature that you want to have in there as an emotional hook. No, I mean, it was interesting because I was preparing the panel. I was going through my own books. I was thinking these are radically different hooks every single time. I don't think there's any formula I could pull out of this whatsoever. It might be because the General Buzz series, which is these guys here with the 4th book coming soon, they're it's a very subversive series of books in many ways, trying to be as subversive as possible, both with the subject matter and the form, with all these weird etymology footnotes and all sorts of crazy crap that I've got enough to in there. But the hooks as well. I mean, one is I start with an AR profile of the main character that just shows up because it's part of the scene, and then whoop, the person swipes it down, and then they're in a board meeting. Another one starts with a waiter, at a table at a restaurant between these two characters, establishing all the tension in the book to come in a space station around Mars. And then another one, which starts with quite a gross scene, or at least which themes that some people might find a bit surprising. With the main character who's now a septuagenarian locked away in an asylum / nursing home. So there's loads there. I think in terms of lessons learned from that, what works and what doesn't, it really all comes down to the voice. It comes down to exactly what Paulette was saying and everybody else. It's about finding your voice, finding a brand, I guess, if you want to call it that way. It's more than that, but if you want to boil it down, something that if your readers are coming to you and your team and saying, oh yeah, this is like my agent who read the first draft of the current fantasy work in progress that I've got, and he says, oh yeah, this is definitely J.R.H. Lawless. When you have people coming in and identifying your work as you, then you've hit the right mark, yeah. Which probably answers a different question, but yeah.
No, that's awesome. That's awesome. Thank you. All right, Ronni, last but certainly not least, tell me what's worked for you, or tell the listeners what's worked for you, what hasn't, on this theme of
some things that have worked for me, I think, again, it's just really giving a sense of who this character is and why and it makes you ask, why is she like this? So typically I write first person, depends on the mood, present or past. And I think that gives me kind of a unique I have this opportunity to give a unique perspective because now everything is colored through my main character's lens. And now we're gonna wonder like, who hurt you or like whatever. So those kinds of things have worked for me. What didn't work for me, especially back when I was querying, was trying to figure out what to add in there and adding too much, like entering pitch contests and trying to like just throw everything in there to get someone interested. So I think again, like if you're doing too much, it's gonna be too much for your reader. Like Paulette, I'm also ADHD and just getting so overwhelmed that like when they say like you lose the plot, like literally you lose the plot because you're just like, I don't know who this is, and oh god, here comes another character, and now they're in a new place. I know how they got there. So I think just finding like that perfect balance, like we've been talking about, of grounding, but also curiosity, making people lean in. And it's definitely been depending on like my character's voice and her upbringing and her environment and like her emotional state right now. Like all these things I feel like work in that in a hook. But and maybe my also thing is also like more interiority or just focusing on her. But again, like I think this may change when depending on like which narrative you use and how many characters you're introducing. But I think that really helps me at least hook a reader because now you're on a journey with this character. And that helps me from not throwing in everything but the kitchen sink or even throwing in the kitchen sink.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Ryan. That is so great. Thank you all so much. I do want to go through and let everyone listening or watching know where we can find you, what you've got going up. But I did want to mention as well, WriteHive is a nonprofit serving the writing community. Jay's already talked about they've got great mentoring. They have a lot of free and inclusive resources. And if you want content like this one, or, you listened to this and said, yes, more on hooks, more on these things, you can look at Word Nerd Cafe episode 17. It's the inciting event versus the hook, or Hook, Line, and Sinker, writing the perfect opening chapter from the 2021 WriteHive conference. So with that, again, thank you so much to the panelists here. We're going to do this again, but starting the other direction. So Ronni, you're first now. Tell us, where can we find you? Where are your books? What have you got coming up? Anything you want our audience to know if they, want to read your stuff.
Okay. Well, you can find me at ronnidavis.com. My handle on all social media is at LilRongal. That's LILRONGAL. I've had that handle since 1997. And then and this is my next book coming out. This Night is Ours. It's coming out in about a week and a half. So that's good times. But yeah,
it will
you
be
can
out
find me
by the time we see this. It will be out. So
that's right.
Everyone will be able to find it when we have this. That's great.
Yes, that's right. I forgot about that. We are being ahead of time. But yeah, so you can find me on all those social medias, on Threads, TikTok. I don't really do a lot on TikTok though. And like Instagram, that's probably where I want to build my biggest community, Instagram and Threads. But yeah, just hit me up.
Awesome. Thanks, Ronni. All right, Jay, where can we find you? What have you got coming?
Well, through the magic of time travel that you just pointed out, I am also right now speaking at the Nebula convention, which is the same weekend. So I'm really glad these are pre-recorded, else that could have been tricky. But I'll still try and make the live bit. But anyway, but yeah, so I'm on a couple of panels there, including one that I'm hosting as chair of the international committee for SIFWA. So we've got like an international authors meet and greet thing, of which multiple people here, obviously, they're definitely very welcome to. But not that everybody isn't welcome. But yeah, so I've got that going there. Book-wise, so obviously there's the 3 books in the General Buzz series, which is Always Greener, The Brood Eye of Rebellion, If It Doesn't Get Consumed, which is right here, which is a rip-off of Shakespeare line, which I gleefully stole. And then This Is the Good Part, which hopefully lives up to its name, which is the most recently released one. More on that coming soon, plus some other works I've got currently in the pipeline, but no dates to announce yet. Short stories as well. I'm in a few collections. You can see them all on big international websites, to not name them. If you just click on the author, then you can author page, you'll see all those. And also I'm in a few recently released craft books, particularly one putting the Fact and Fantasy, which was a Writer's Digest book edited by Dan Kobold, which was really cool, and that came out just a few months ago. And yeah, definitely hit me up on the socials, as the kids say, at SpaceLawyerSF, anywhere. That's very much me, and lawlessauthor.com.
Thank you. Anna, where can we find you? What have you got coming up if we want to, see more from you and your thrillers?
So my website is annabritton.co.uk. And you can find me on Twitter and Instagram and TikTok at Britton Book Geek. And yeah, so Shot in the Dark is out now. I don't think we're time traveling enough that Close to the Edge will be out because that's in September. But that's the second in the series. And one thing I've started quite recently is a new podcast called the Rejected Writers Club, which is authors coming on and talking honestly about their experiences of rejection. So yeah, that's kind of me.
I like that. All right, Matthew, tell us, where can we find you? What you got coming up?
Obviously the books are everywhere you can find books, all the various websites. I'm at MatthewPhillion.com. I am excessively online if anybody wants to ever talk shop about writing. I'm either Matthew Phillion or Matt Phillion, depending on if I started the account before I had my first book come out or not. But either one is always me. And I love talking shop in whatever social media you prefer. Except I'm still afraid of TikTok. I'm on TikTok. I'm just afraid of it because I don't think anybody wants to watch my gigantic bald head making videos. But upcoming, I've got an anthology that'll, due to the nature of time travel, it's supposed to be out in June, but the date is still a little nebulous, so it might be before, it might be after the panel. And it's just an anthology collecting different stories set in the same shared world that all my books are in. It's just a chance to kind of gather everything that's been out there that's sort of ancillary material and get it into a nice printed collected edition. And if you're on the Northeast, I'll be at Fan Expo Boston, the Comic-Con here in Boston in June, and I'll be down at Trificon in a Comic-Con at a casino, which is about the trippiest thing you can possibly do, down in Connecticut in August. And the upside of writing genre fiction is I get to go to Comic-Cons instead of literary festivals and see everybody in costume. So that's where to find me. Yeah, that's me.
Awesome. Well, and cosplay and casinos are two of my favorite things, so I'm very interested. I'm going to be looking that up for sure. All right, Paulette, as I told Ronni, last but not least, anyway, Paulette, tell us what you've got coming up, where we can find you.
You can find me at PauletteKennedy.com, on socials, Threads, Instagram, and TikTok at pkennedywrites. And my next novel will be out in 2025. It's another historical Gothic set in the 1920s.
Very cool. Well, a few of these panelists may be able to hang out for a little bit to answer questions on Discord. We don't know because we don't know when exactly we're going to be set, but hopefully, if not, you can, write the questions and I will get them to them later. Anyways, thank you all so much for listening and watching. And thank you so much again to the panelists for sharing all of this wealth of information. And we will see you later.
Thank you for the awesome moderating.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.